Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're exploring dating, relationships, commitments, all those things that animate our romantic lives. This episode was sponsored by our dearest friends, Jerry and Esther Williams, in honor of the incredibly important work of Shalom Task Force. I am so incredibly grateful for their friendship and support. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Be sure to check it out online. There's great stuff. 1840.org. One of the questions that I think particularly Orthodox Jews ask a lot, but I think everybody asks all of the time, is they wonder, is this normal? Is this what other people do? I don't know if a lot of people ask that. Maybe the very question, is this normal, is something I've asked myself. Is it normal that I ask myself if this is normal so often? But a lot of times, particularly in parts of our lives where we're not sure what to compare, what the baseline is in other people's lives, we ask ourselves, is this normal? Is it normal for me to be having these thoughts, these concerns, these doubts? Is my level of anxiety normal? Something that you would ask a therapist. And I think there's one area that maybe we don't even ask the question enough, but there are so many resources to help us address it, and that is the question, is this normal in terms of our relationship, in terms of our marriages, in terms of our dating process? Is it normal the way that this person spoke to me, the way that this person makes me feel? Is this just the normal feelings that everybody has? Is it normal that I'm not more excited, that I'm less excited? Is it normal that I sometimes get into fights or disagreements with a spouse? I think a lot of times we ask this question, is it normal? Because we have very little information to know what is going on in everybody else's lives. This is rightfully called our intimate lives. And I use the term intimate lives deliberately, not because it refers to anything sexual, because this is the closest, the inner sanctum of our lives. We don't ever really quite know what is going on in other people's marriages. We sometimes surmise. I have no doubt that other people, again, now everything's going to come back to the question, is this normal? But you hang out with another couple and then kind of the debrief that makes you kind of feel better. It's like, how do you think they're doing? How do you think that they're holding up? You can sometimes ask, the same way that on dates, so often when you're kind of struggling to make conversation, or an easy way to make conversations, instead of talking about your actual relationship or how this date is going, what do? You watch all the other dates. What do you think they're up to? What do you think they're talking about? Do they look comfortable? Do they look uncomfortable? I think this kind of speculative dance is something that is quite normal, but in something that is so important and so central to our lives, it is not enough to rest on the laurels and think, yeah, we're probably doing okay. We're probably okay. So we fight every once in a while. That's not so bad. I think we really need to think about how we assess the health of our relationships and what are, in fact, the red flags that we need to know either going into a relationship or once within a relationship to know whether or not, is this normal, is this healthy? The episode that I always think about is from a show called 30 Rock, which is one of my all-time favorites. It's not quite up there in the pantheon of The Office as a show that has been nearly universally accepted and beloved in the Jewish community. It should be up there. It is quite brilliant. It's a little offbeat in its humor, but there's one fantastic story. A lot of it takes place in the episode known as the Deal Breakers Talk Show, where the main character, played by Tina Fey, has this one-liner that she keeps on telling couples, that's a deal breaker.
Shut it down. Deal breaker.
And this to me is kind of like the larger equivalent of red flags. Like, that's a deal breaker. This is something that should not be happening within the confines, within the context of a relationship. Is it okay to fight? Is it okay to disagree? I assume. I'm not a therapist, but I assume, of course. Otherwise, I think we're all in trouble. But what, in fact, are those red flags? How do we assess them? How do we figure them out? And where do we go if, God forbid, we feel like we are in need of help? And to understand all of this, 1840 1840 has partnered with an incredible organization known as Shalom Task Force. Shalom Task Force reached out to me for my least favorite reason ever, and that is they wanted to honor the work of 1840. Now, that is very flattering, and indeed I was incredibly flattered, but I have a long time genetic predisposition to having absolute emotional breakdowns when it comes to not only just attending organizational dinners, but certainly getting honored by them. The approach in my family, my father, if you ever try, and he has been approached to be in shul dinners, and he's just like, look, I have an illness. I am unable to do this. Please, God, just find somebody else. I'm not able to do it. And that is normally my response. It gives me a tremendous amount of anxiety. I'm not in the dinner circuit, the dinner scene. I don't really go to many of them. I try to contribute to the organizations I find most important. But when Shalom Task Force reached out, the reason why they reached out was so deeply moving to me that the answer had to be yes. They reached out because they said, look, we're looking at the landscape of the Jewish community and we see the work that 1840 is doing, and we think that we are kindred spirits. We approached and confronted an issue that was almost never spoken about for so many years, namely the issue of domestic violence in communities that's now been expanded within Shalom Task Force to include so much more, including high school education. They have an incredible hotline that will mention the number just at the very top. There's a confidential hotline for people who are really suffering or are unsure what to do in their romantic lives, in their marriages, in their relationships. And that toll-free number, which I'm going to say, I didn't ask them permission, though I asked a lot of our guests whether or not they know it by heart. It's not quite Hatzalah or an ambulance service that you have to know off the top of your head, but I'll give it to you in case one of our listeners needs it. They really do incredible work. Their number is 888-883-2323. Again, that's 888-883-2323. That's the Shalom Task Force hotline, which really does such incredible work. And I know people personally who have been helped by the work of Shalom Task Force. And to me, an organization that has dedicated itself to kind of stepping into the darkness, stepping into the shadows of our lives, of our communal lives, to talk, confront, and provide education, healing, support, comfort in an issue that is not as exciting, not as rosy and joyful as so many other issues that gain so much support, to me was an absolute privilege to partner with them, particularly on this episode, which is why I am so excited for this episode, which is going to be talking about the work of Shalom Task Force. This isn't an organizational pitch. This is not a pitch specifically for Shalom Task Force, but this is a pitch to the larger issue that they deal with, which I think is the most important issue in somebody's life, and that is finding and ensuring they are in a healthy relationship. It's a question in the back of our minds while we are dating. It's a question that we often dismiss until it is too late, until we are in trouble. And to know that there is a way to find help, there is a way to seek help. There are educational resources to educate yourself before you start dating, while you are dating, before you get married, while you are married, is an incredible service that I knew I wanted to partner on, because to me, at the heart of the work of 1840 is not theological issues. It is not even sociological issues, though we deal with both in spades. It is really stepping into the inner world of people's lives that we have the privilege of being invited into. And that inner world are our relationships. I think very often the brokenness that we feel in our relationships is often manifest in theological issues. It is often manifest in the way that we relate to the larger community. But at its heart is that deeply emotional issue of how we form, maintain, cultivate healthy relationships. And I believe deeply that so many of our other religious issues really stem from this founding principle. It is not my idea. It's an idea that we've quoted earlier in our Teshuvah series, particularly in that final episode on parental alienation, an idea that was said by the Vilna Gaon, who said that the litmus test for how you understand the character of a person is how they treat their spouse, how they treat their loved ones. It is not whether or not they're showing up on time to mincha, as important as that is. It is not their level of Torah scholarship, as important as that is. If you want to understand the character of an individual, it is not figuring out, how much they talk about God in their lives. It is how do they treat their spouse, their loved ones, the ones closest to them in their lives. That is the litmus test. And to me, is a litmus test of our inner religious health, of our inner emotional health. And that is why the work of Shalom Task Force, of stepping into that inner sanctum, the Kodesh Kodashim, the holy of holies of our lives, the family unit, the context of the family, it's such a privilege to partner with them. I partner with them for another reason, and that is who called me to ask. And that is one one of my oldest, dearest friends, and that is Esther Williams. As you will hear in the interview, Esther Williams and I have an incredible, long history together. I admire her dearly. I've known her since I was a young teenager, her and her entire family, and I would be remiss if I didn't give at least a shout out to, I think, what must be my number one fan, and that is Esther's husband, Jerry Williams, who was also the president of HALB for many years. He was very involved in the high school that I went to. I consider him a mentor. We don't speak as often as I would like to, and I never am able to respond to his many, many emails and letters that he sends me because he is so effusive and affectionate. But really the role that Esther and Jerry have played in my life and their entire family means so much to me, which is why it was such a privilege to talk to the president, the person who was there and understands the founding of Shalom Task Force, somebody who I have a deep history with, my conversation with Esther Williams. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome in a person who I've known nearly my entire life. She works as the lay president of Shalom Task Force. It is my pleasure to welcome my friend, Esther Williams.
Hi.
Esther, I'm so excited to speak with you about this, and there's so many both communal and personal connections that we have together, and I wanted to start with the communal. You are the lay president, is that the correct term?
Correct, co-president at this point.
Co-president of Shalom Task Force, and I guess where I want to start and really understand is I remember growing up and hearing about Shalom Task Force. There used to be like stickers for the hotline that you would say, and it was like very scary to hear about, like there are spouses who are hitting each other or who are domestic. It's a very scary term. I'm curious, what prompted the founding of this organization?
Okay. The original organization was started by Nechama Wolfson. She had gotten a phone call from Dr. Hilton Lightman, local pediatrician, who said he was seeing an inordinate number of victims of domestic violence. We couldn't understand it. I've never heard of it before.
Because Dr. Lightman, who, just to be clear, he lives across the street from where I grew up. I don't want to give away his address, but he lives right near. And he was like the local doctor of
local
the community.
Pediatrician who many people were using. What we found out was that there was a government-funded shelter not far from his office that had hired an Orthodox social worker. Because of that, if a woman at the end of her tethers or a victim, and I say woman and victim, those are not phrases we use anymore. We now know that many victims are men, and we call them survivors. If they called the National Domestic Abuse Hotline and said anything about being Jewish, they were automatically sent to this particular shelter. So he was seeing an inordinate number, not proportionate. But not knowing anything about domestic abuse, we decided to find out what was going on. I would like to say that it proves that community members can galvanize to address serious issues without necessarily being professionals in that field. Most of the women who worked were not.
I mean, they weren't psychologists.
Not necessarily, not
they
psychologists.
They together to start an organization to address this
issue. And we're talking
issue.
about pre-O.J. Simpson, pre-anything that the world at large was talking about. The early 90s, very early 90s. They allowed us to bring these women home for Shabbos, which was not a good idea, very dangerous.
What does that mean, to bring them home for Shabbos?
The shelter allowed us to take the women with their children to our homes for Shabbos.
Okay.
Very bad idea in terms of the safety of the women. I still to this day don't know why they allowed it, but it did help us understand what was going on.
You had women coming to your house?
Yes, all of us. And it helped us understand. I'm a very strong believer in not reinventing the wheel. We have many resources, but for some reason, these women weren't able to access the resources that were available. That's how we started the hotline, learning that there was really a problem with connection, not so much with resources. After having been on the hotline for about 15 years.
A hotline, just to understand what that is.
Yeah.
You have a toll-free number, I assume?
There's a toll-free number. It's totally confidential.
Yeah.
Totally confidential. The advocates who man the hotline have intense training, and they're supervised. Anybody can call.
Do you know the number by heart? I'm just curious.
I used to. I'm a lot older than I was.
Yeah, okay.
I don't give the wrong number, but
we'll,
Shana will give you all the
absolutely
information.
Listen.
Exactly.
It's an important number for people to know and to have.
The calls started coming in from last night was Sheva Brachos, and he called me a name, to last night was the last Sheva Brachos of my last child and I want out, and everything possible in between, and not only women calling, children, men, etc. So after 5 years on the hotline, we began to question what was missing from the system to help these women.
Because you're hearing the tail end, people who are in abusive relationships.
So there were two things. One was the tail end, was generally in a survivor will be the person who has been financially abused as well, and therefore has no access to resources, so that the the perpetrator will get a barracuda lawyer and they'll end up on a legal aid system. We're very lucky to get a grant to hire lawyers who understand both the family court system and based in to help these women.
Okay.
That was one end of the spectrum, the woman who was at the end. But we kept questioning the women we were speaking to. Every one of them practically said, I saw something before, but I chose to ignore it. What is going on in our system that allows people to get to that point?
What were those red flags? It's so interesting, and I want to zoom outwards and take you back because I don't know if you're comfortable talking about this, but I certainly am. But I had made the distinct mistake of not only knowing the head of Shalom Task Force, but I actually dated your daughter.
Correct.
In high school. And
Do you really want to go here?
I absolutely do want to go here because
Okay.
I want to tell you something. The first time that your daughter, Talia, brought me over to your house, thank God we are both extraordinarily happily married. I adore her husband, Eitan. Absolutely
You're
wonderful.
both married amazing people who are the antithesis of each of you.
Oh,
Yes.
absolutely. So that's kind
Absolutely.
of what I want to get to because the first time I was brought over to your house,
Yeah.
you sat me down and had a conversation with me. Do you remember that?
No.
You sat me down in...
I do remember telling my daughter not to marry you, but that's a separate
That's a separate thing. That's really what we're here to discuss. No, this was in high school. This was in 12th grade. We had met the summer before, and it was a little nerve-wracking because my sister, who's also very involved, also spent that summer after 11th grade and met somebody in the very same camp, and they are married today.
Correct.
So I think there was concern that whether curse or blessing, depending how you saw it, was going to continue. But you sat me down in your kitchen. I remember exactly where it was. And you said, we have to talk about abuse. And I was like, dear God,
Really?
this is 100% true.
I don't remember
And
that.
this is the question you posed to me. I am in 12th grade. Your daughter is about a year older than me, right? She's a year and 15 days older than me. You sat me down and said, if somebody comes to you, a couple comes to you, and they allege abuse to one another, what do you do in that situation? Mm-hmm. And I was like, this relationship is not going to last. That was my first response. Like, this is not going to go as far as I thought.
There was probably a pre-conversation to that. I don't think that was the first question.
No.
I asked, but-
This
okay.
is and you sat
Okay.
me. We knew each other.
Right.
We knew each other. Our families knew each other.
Right.
And you said,
It was probably at the point when I was really doing a lot of research to understand how people perceive it, how the society perceives it, how young people perceive it. It was really learning for me.
exactly, because you sat me down and I started, I always consider myself, I'm, so empathetic or, psychologically insightful or whatever it is. And I started giving you some answers about what I would tell them. And I said, the first thing you do is you have to separate them. Because you're not going to get the full story when one is in front of the other. You need to make sure that they are safe and they are separate. And it stayed with me to this day. And what I think back when I reflect on that first time, like sitting down as your, somebody who was dating your daughter, I could only imagine the personal component. You have this daughter who's wonderful and lovely. She's dating this boy whose family, good, decent people. We weren't the Williams family in our community.
The Bashevkins can hold their own
We had
very
a fine
well.
reputation.
Very well.
A fine reputation.
Yes.
But that's part of the problem, is that reputation guarantees nothing.
Correct. That is absolutely correct. But I honestly, David, I wasn't worried about you per se. I was really...
No, but I'm even not calling you out
Right.
because you know what the truth is? I was worried about me.
Oh, interesting.
I was worried about me because when I think back at my 12th grade self, I was nervous about making sure that the relationship that I was going to cultivate was going to be healthy. And high school is the worst training ground for that.
Absolutely. It's so interesting that you say that because one of the things that we've been trying very much was not only be talking to young women who are in some ways more vulnerable, but talking to young men because they are equally vulnerable on both sides of the spectrum. For both men and women.
To both be abusers and to be abused.
To be victims and to be perpetrators equally.
Yes.
Just like women are. The whole concept of women being the only ones who are victims is a very old-fashioned and incorrect one. And we've been going into boys' schools and it's been fascinating what we're learning and what we're teaching. How many of them are victims? And how many of them are frightened of exactly what you said or unaware of their own tendencies towards aggression.
And that's kind of what I want to get into and what you unpack for them, because I was on, a school that your family, in particular, your esteemed husband, no, I must mention him. He called me, I want you to know, your husband, Jerry, who I know for many, he has been calling me nonstop, says, I better get a shout out. He's been calling me nonstop.
That sounds, anyone who knows Jerry would absolutely
this is
believe
true.
that.
texting
You're
me,
right.
calling me, David, like, you bet,
Right.
I need to hear my name. Like,
Right.
again, he loves the spotlight.
Because his name is everywhere, right?
He loves the spotlight. So I remember that I was on a Shabbaton for my high school as an alumni, and they had a panel session. It was myself, Josh Rosenfeld, and I think maybe Hillel Broder, who's the current president, but me and Josh Rosenfeld for sure, both alumni. And they asked us, what are some of your regrets from high school? And it's an interesting question. You know, no one's an angel in high school. I loved learning. I learned a lot in high school. Had the distinct pleasure of my 11th and 12th grade Rebbe also being your cousin. So it really formed this whole web. But I remember I thought about it for a second, and you know, I made a ton of mistakes in high school. And the thing that came to mind was the way I treated women. I didn't think it was healthy. I didn't think it was appropriate. I wouldn't term it abusive. Certainly wasn't criminal, but it felt manipulative. It didn't feel like I had the training and skills to foster a healthy relationship in 12th grade. And I'm so curious, at that point, Shalom Task Force was not coming into high schools and teaching. What are the principles that you are teaching to help people? Because I don't think anybody plans to be an abusive spouse.
Absolutely not, and nobody plans to be a survivor or victim either. No one goes into a relationship and says, I'm going to be X.
Correct. So, like, I think to myself, like, I was nervous. There was a girl who I did not have a healthy relationship with. I don't want to paint myself out to be a monster, but I think there's a normalcy to having unhealthy relationships. And I remember this young woman telling me, she says, David, like, it was a big compliment, but she also meant it a little bit as like a caution. She said, you have the koach hadibur. You are able to speak in a certain way that's able to get people to do what you want, to get people to have this power of influence. That is a dangerous thing, and she was telling it to me in the context of beware of this.
She's a very smart young woman, but if you listen to most perpetrators...
Was it your daughter?
I know who it was.
You probably know exactly who
Yes.
it was.
But she's a very smart young lady. Most perpetrators, when you describe them to people outside of the home, they will say that they have a lot of charm. And they have the ability to be very, very charming and persuasive.
Yes.
And maybe that's what gives them the ability to get to where they are. But I think Shoshannah Frydman, our executive director, Dr.
We're
Frydman,
speaking to,
right, who
as
will
a
be
part
able
of
to
this
give you
episode.
more of the mental health piece of it. But we have to understand that there's healthy relationships, there are unhealthy relationships, and there are abusive relationships. There's a fine line between them, but unhealthy relationships don't necessarily become seriously abusive. The difference between an abusive and unhealthy relationship is in an abusive relationship, there's a person walking on eggshells. There's a factor of control, of power and control. That doesn't mean that we don't all do things that might be termed abusive, but to label a relationship abusive or to label someone a perpetrator, there tends to be a pattern.
Yeah.
It's not, I did one stupid thing, I got angry once. It's
Sure.
not that sort of thing. There's a pattern.
What I want to know, just reflecting yourself, you're a mother, you have an incredible family, you have incredible kids. Shout out to your son, Chaim, who just had a cameo in the Hulu show The Patient, saying Ashrei, really a fantastic job, now a Hollywood star. But I'm curious, you know, as a parent, you are both deeply involved in Shalom Task Force, and you weren't sitting me down because you thought I was going to, God forbid, be an abuser. But I have no doubt that you have married off K'nai Nahara, all of your children, you have grandchildren who are married. And I'm just trying to understand, you are always wearing two hats, because I know you well enough to know that you are not taking off that second hat. You're always looking to see healthiness, and that's a tough thing to estimate. It's a tough thing to project out into the future. What are you looking for as a mother, somebody who's been on the phone with people, somebody who has been deeply involved in the work of creating healthy relationships, preventing abusive and unhealthy relationships? What are you looking for when one of your own children brings home a spouse? What are the signs that make you nervous, and what are the things that you're like, phew?
So I'll be very honest with you, something I don't generally talk about it, but I did have one child who was involved in a very unhealthy relationship, and it taught me, even after years and years and years of experience with the Shalom Task Force, that nobody is, not even me, nobody is immune to being in that kind of situation. Someone may be very vulnerable at a certain time in their lives because of certain circumstances that are going on. What troubles me is we start in high school. We really need to start talking about relationships and modeling relationships. If you're starting to talk to your children when they're dating about healthy relationships, you are way too late. This has to be something that has to be started within the family, within the community, on every level of what is a healthy relationship, what we tolerate, what we don't tolerate, bullying.
Are there specific behaviors that you think we tolerate in our community that you wish you never saw?
Absolutely.
Can you mention any of them?
I'll give you just off the cuff of my head that we teach young women that they have to be mevater on every level.
Mevater meaning?
Concede on everything. To be an Eshet Chayil, you have to concede. I'm not saying within a marriage there isn't plenty of time to concede, but it should not be in the dating relationship.
It's not the foundational principle.
Yes, but we hear it so early on in the education system of young women in the Haredi community.
I hear it, I think, in the modern Orthodox community, I think, grapples with these issues as well.
That particular thing, I think, is a very
this
big
notion
challenge.
of like, don't stand in the way of...
Right. The way the dating system is brings a lot of pressure to impress and to look away from things. Teaching our children to trust their gut and that we respect them for trusting their gut. That when something is uncomfortable. Teaching...
That last point, I just want to linger on that for 1 second because I spoke about this. We did a series on abuse, specifically rabbinic abuse within our community, and the notion of trusting your intuition.
But that requires a parent or an educator to listen. They have to know that someone's really going to listen to them when they express that. So that also requires, when you're having a conversation with your child, to ask questions that will elicit them to address that gut feeling and for you to validate it.
That is so important. In order to develop your intuition, you need someone who can listen and who really creates a space where you're able to learn to trust your intuition. Whenever you and I speak, there are always two conversations taking place because we know each other so well. But I am curious, when you reflect back as a parent, do you think you fostered an environment with your children that allowed them to trust their intuition on this? Because part of me actually says, I know specific instances where the answer is absolutely yes. You created certain space. I remember you told Talia and I certain things that allowed us that if anything was going wrong or not good, you knew that you were there to listen. But as a parent, it's very hard to... create that sense of a child trusting their intuition.
It is very challenging, but that's in all areas of teaching your children, of validating, having them have a very strong sense of self. And I remember one of my children was dating somebody seriously, and Jerry was very not happy about it. And he said, tell them to break up. And he had good reason. And I said they have to come to this themselves. They really have to own this themselves. They have to be able to see it for themselves and own it. Parenting is very difficult. It's not easy.
Especially when it's in the context of relationships, where it is so hard to learn, even in the biblical sense, where it talks about, you leave your family to start your own. It is the hardest thing. I know for me, it was really, really challenging, this notion of creating an independent sense of self outside of your family, it's circular because your family is really what forges your sense of self, and you take it with you and perpetuate both the qualities that you admire and the difficulties. I have no doubt in my own home that all of the wonderful things I saw among my parents are manifest here, and the things that were imperfect.
I always say, mirror, mirror on the wall, I am my mother after all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I see it with my father, the things that stress me out, the things that every generation moves it like an inch. And what I think impresses me so much about Shalom Task Force is that the preventative measures that you take, they're not solutions in the way that it's going to fix everything. But I feel like every class is moving another few inches, another few feet to have more self-awareness and more trust of their own intuition and more self-awareness of their imperfections.
But it requires an entire environment to support that. Teachers have to support it. It's got to be across the board. We have to create an entire environment where the same message is being given across the board, from your college teacher, from your mechanechet, from your rebbe, from your parents, the same message across the board. And that's part of community. Really, really critical. When we talk to young people, we ask them first and foremost, first of all, they need to know themselves before they start in relationships. And then to really think, if you were in a complicated situation, who would you go to? And it's not their mother for everyone. It's not their father. But that there is a person, a mentor, somebody that you can trust and that you can tell everything to.
I'm just curious because I happen to agree with you. I was once in a situation where I was concerned about a couple, very concerned about a couple. And I went to speak to my Rebbe and asking, what should I do? I want to help them out. I said, should I call this woman's mother? And he looked at me, he's like, definitely not.
Right.
But why is that the answer?
It depends. It depends. Yeah. Every relationship is unique. You know people. I mean, if a mother is a type of mother who's going to say, oh no, he's such a wonderful boy, and look, I mean, everyone's dying for the shidduch, so you have to go out with him again, instead of, Hanallah, Tell me about it. What didn't feel right on this date? You know?
Do you think as a mother you were too involved in your children's relationships or not involved enough? If you had to pick one.
Oh, that's a tough one. I'd have to answer differently for every one of my children.
Because it is a tough balance.
It is, and every child is different, and every child's needs were different. I don't think that's a simple question to ask. But I think a lot of training for parents in this particular area is important. But again, you can't show up when your kid starts dating and start being the right kind of parent for relationships. It's really a lot of modeling and a lot of things that start. I wish we could start education in kindergarten.
Well, ultimately, I believe
we're moving in that direction with bullying and everything. We are moving in that direction in terms of teaching kids how to stand up to a bully.
Yeah. No, but the hardest thing is to bring communal change requires bringing people in who have already begun living their lives and already have incorrect behaviors that they've soaked up. You know, I've had teachers who, you know, had unhealthy modeling about relationships, about boundary issues, about their own marriages hanging on by a thread. And it's really hard because it is all encompassing, and to bring change when you can't put all of Jewish education, all of the Jewish community on pause and say, you know, like Trump, like we're stopping all education until we figure out what's going on here. Like,
okay, so I think it's little by little, but I think little by little grows. I think having required premarital counseling for couples. We have a Shalom workshop, for example. The rate of divorce is very high. How many of those divorces do you think should really be happening?
Meaning that it was possible to salvage.
How many?
I have no idea.
Right. How many of them definitely should have happened? So the ones that perhaps should not have happened, perhaps with the right, you know, the Protestants, the Catholics, you need to do premarital counseling before you get married. They won't marry you in the church without it.
My wife and I absolutely did premarital counseling.
So whether it's a Shalom workshop or it's premarital with a therapist, it doesn't label you unhealthy. It teaches you the skills. Therapists who've seen people who have taken our workshop, our premarital workshop before, tell us that you could tell which couple has their communication skills, their ability to solve problems together are far superior. They're basic skills. And unfortunately, what's happening, if they don't have those skills in place, a healthy relationship becomes unhealthy.
This is absolutely fascinating work, and I'm so excited to hear more from Shana, because I really do believe at the center of religious life, at the center of Jewish communal life, is familial health, the health of your family.
No question.
It is the holy of holies of our religious life. And I guess like as a final question to you that I am curious about is, there are so many issues that you could have gotten involved in. I know, you know, your husband has his issues that he likes to do, and, you know, you've been on boards of different organizations, etc., but your baby has always been, to my knowledge, Shalom Task Force. And I'm curious why. Like, what brought you to this issue? On the OU, you know, I know you were an OU board member.
I just finished 25 years, term limited.
Yeah, so I mean...
First senior vice president, female, among the first female.
Yeah, correct, and you did so much stuff, but your baby was always Shalom Task Force.
So it's interesting. My degree is in Greek and Roman classics, nothing to do with this.
Okay.
It's kind of... literally something I fell into.
You know, growing up, I thought you were the swimmer.
Yeah, well, then you're very, very old if you knew who she was. Or you watched very late night TV, one or the other. I'm a lousy swimmer. It was really fell into my lap, and just, you know, you become passionate about something. It's not something, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I would have dreamed that I would be doing or be involved in. I really have to give a tremendous shout out to the 100 advocates that we have, women like myself who have made this their passion. Your sister among them, she's amazing. They are wonderful, wonderful, committed and passionate people. And I think as a community grows to become more committed and passionate to this cause, we really can make a humongous difference in the landscape of Jewish family life.
I am so grateful to you and your work. And the joke that we have is that while I did not marry your daughter...
I'm still the schwigger.
You're still the schwigger. You are still my honorary mother-in-law and somebody who I can turn to really to address some of, you know, the most important things in life, and as a sounding board and somebody who gives me a tremendous amount of encouragement. It is my absolute pleasure to speak today with Esther Williams.
Thanks so much.
Esther is the lay head of Shalom Task Force, but it was important to me to talk to somebody who has really been through the hardship of a broken relationship itself, which is why I reached out to somebody who works very closely with Shalom Task Force. Her name is Breezy. She is absolutely incredible, and she is somebody who found a path out of of a marriage that fell apart for all of the worst reasons and found a way out, found a way to reconstruct her life, reorient her life, and build healthy relationships. And that's why I thought it was so crucial and so important to speak and have a conversation with a survivor of abuse, of an abusive relationship. This is, as a part of our special episode on red flags, somebody who has really seen the red up close, the flag waving back and forth. This is our conversation with Breezy. I am so excited to speak with Breezy Schwartz, who has spoken many times on behalf of Shalom Task Force and has a powerful story of her own about really escaping an abusive and unhealthy relationship. Breezy, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So I'm really talking about your first marriage that has ended. And what I would like to understand is, before we get into maybe the actual abuse, I really am curious about what were the red flags going into the relationship, if there were any, or it was just like this was perfect and came out of the clear blue sky.
No, I mean, there definitely were red flags. I think that I love the shidduch system in a lot of ways, but I was also like one of the last of my friends to be getting married. So I think that for me, it kind of made me not want to necessarily focus on all of the red flags.
Fascinating.
I also was on the heavier side, so I had a harder time getting set up on dates also. And this guy just loved me. And he thought like I was like the best thing in the world, which is a phenomenal feeling, and I came from a great family, so to not be getting set up. So it that helped to like kind of push a lot of the things out of my line of vision. During dating, I mean, people always say like you have to look at how they treat the people around you. Like, how do they treat the waiters? How do they talk to other people? But I think for me, one of the big things is, how do they tell a story when they're talking about themselves or about things that happen? So one of the things that my ex used to do is every time he would tell a story, he made himself sound like the smartest person in the room. He was the best, and everybody else around him was like an idiot. And he would like make fun of people or put them down, just the way he spoke. And as we got married, and I realized that that's how he treats everybody.
Like almost like it sounds like a narcissistic quality, but it's so interesting as a red flag, because whenever I speak to people who are, either contending or getting out of difficult relationships, I think about myself, and like, as a red flag, it's not a deal breaker, somebody who tells stories like that. Meaning at that point, you weren't like, oh, I need to break up this relationship.
Right, no.
Tell me a little bit about what was the first sign that this is more than just maybe we use the word so imprecisely, a narcissistic, somebody who has a very healthy sense of ego. At what point did you realize this is actually abusive?
There's different types of abuse. There's verbal, there's physical, there's emotional, there's religious, there's social media, there's all different types. And I really had the full gamut of it. And I think that any abuser kind of works slowly, and they kind of make you question yourself almost. So they kind of break you down in a way that you don't feel self-confident. So for me, and something that a lot of people who are in abusive situations told me, is that even once you kind of realize, okay, wait, I'm in an abusive situation, it's kind of like the crazy, there's never usually one moment. And once you do get that one moment, that's usually when you decide if you're staying or leaving.
Just that quote that I love, finish that quote, the crazy
The crazy is easier than the crazy you don't know.
Correct.
When you're in an abusive situation, you know how to, I don't want to say control or handle your abuser, but you know how to predict what's going to happen and what's going to be. I hate to say this, but somebody said it to me. The only time you ever hear on the news about people like somebody murdering somebody in an abusive relationship is when the person's trying to leave. Abusers like control. So my ex loved controlling me. I started realizing right after we got married, I got pregnant pretty much right away. And I was extremely sick. I was on bed rest. They in the beginning didn't even know what was wrong with me. They weren't even sure if I was pregnant or not. And we kept going for all these tests, and I couldn't move. They wanted to hospitalize me with IVs and everything. And all of a sudden my ex started becoming sick, and he needed attention. And the fact that anyone was paying any attention to me. I mean, when we were engaged, he would like try to get out of doing things or try to get out of helping us. Like my engagement party, he like literally picked up at the end of the engagement party and left, and nobody could find him. And finally, we all just went back to the house. We're like, okay, we have no idea where he was, and he's fast asleep in the house. Meanwhile, all the rest of us, including my baby sister, were all helping schlep all the gifts and the packages, his family, my family, everybody, and he just went MIA. Like your engagement
party to take a nap.
To take a nap.
That hits close to home for me, I'll be honest with you.
Right.
It's nothing I needed more, but I'm so fascinated by this where it's a slow creep where you are never able to be at the center of somebody else's story or somebody else's life. It began when you were pregnant. Can you take me through each escalation of just like when you slowly felt the walls closing in, the walls of control on this relationship?
Yeah, I mean, after we got married, there were a lot of like small things that he wouldn't do. He wouldn't take out the garbage. He wouldn't help with stuff. Then I got pregnant and I was very sick and I really needed the help. And we were both working and we both had nice incomes at the time. And so at the time I wanted to get a housekeeper. He didn't want to spend the money on it. We had just gotten married and, nobody bought us our furniture. We had to buy our furniture and he didn't want to buy furniture. Like I said, let's go to IKEA. And he didn't want to, like, everything was about what he wanted to control and how he wanted to control it. In the beginning, we kind of thought it was him trying to get my parents to pay for things like a manipulative way, which it was partially, but it was him just having control. If I said the sky was blue, he would fight with me and say, no, it's a turquoisey, aqua-y, like no matter what I said, it wasn't right.
I'm curious, like the progression, because it's a very slow build that I'm hearing.
Yeah. And then after I had my first child, things were really good. And I decided then I wanted to open a store.
Okay.
I had been working in the family business at the time and he loved the idea. So what started as like my idea became ours. He was an accountant. He has a degree in accounting and I have a degree in business and marketing management. And I was running one of my family businesses at the time. So I had a lot of knowledge. I knew the day-to-day operating and I understood those things. And he just totally didn't matter what I said or what I did or how successful I was in what I was doing. We were going to start this business and he was going to like run the show almost. But then slowly, he got caught up in his own accounting business. He, had a really great job for a huge firm. And so he was kind of leaving me alone a little bit. So when you look forward to accounting season, because your husband's not going to be home until really late when you're already asleep, something's kind of wrong. I had a newborn baby and I couldn't wait for accounting season to start so he wouldn't be around.
Was there an incident that led to you saying, I am in an abusive relationship, or it was just this gentle, slow build of feeling you looking around and suddenly realizing I've lost all my autonomy? Or I would almost phrase it differently. If I were to ask you and this first husband, was there an incident? Do you think you'd both give the same answer?
Yeah, I think we both know when I had decided after I had my son that this marriage wasn't working out and I didn't want to go ahead with it anymore. And I wanted to get divorced. And I was talking to my parents at the time and my parents were very supportive and they just said, okay, whatever you need, whatever you want. My parents saw it. My parents knew exactly what I was going through. Apparently I didn't realize at the time, but like when we would go to my parents for Shabbos, I have a younger sister. I'm the oldest of 6 and my baby sister and my son are 6 years apart. So I'm there with a newborn baby and I have a 6-year-old sister in the house. And I had also a 10-year-old brother and he was like tormenting them, like my sister and my brother. And my mother used to have to protect them from him. That was stuff I didn't know. So my mother kind of didn't always want us around. So when I said I was ready to get divorced, they were very supportive. But stuff ended up happening and I ended up staying in the marriage. And
Breezy, I'm sorry to cut you off. My question is, was there an incident? I don't need to know the details.
Hold on.
It just sounded like you almost yada, yada, yada.
No. Let me get to the crunch. So we were going to separate. Something happened, which meant that we could not get separated. Then I got pregnant with my daughter. My daughter was born and I felt like I needed to give it a try for her. I forced him back into therapy for the 4th time. It wasn't working. And in my head, I said, okay, no, this marriage is over. I have to figure out like an exit strategy. And I asked him to watch the kids for an hour so I could run to the supermarket. And I came back to find my daughter in life-threatening danger.
Wow.
That he had put her in. And that's when I said, that's it. Because I was willing to put up with the abuse, the physical abuse for me. For the kids at that point, it was verbal and emotional abuse towards the children, but it wasn't physical. And I kind of felt like, well, maybe they were still babies. They were 3 and 1. So I kind of felt like maybe I could still protect them or save them. But once he put my daughter in physical harm, that was it. Like, I couldn't let anything happen to my kid. And that for me was my final moment.
When you look back at marriage therapy, what do you think it was able to provide? And what do you think, obviously it wasn't able to save the marriage. What do you think mistakes you may have made or that marriage therapy was not able to address ultimately? Did it have any benefit?
There were some benefits and then there were some dangers. Not all therapists are qualified to deal with abusive situations. And you don't necessarily know that until you get in the situation. And sometimes a therapist, as well-meaning as they are, end up putting you in a more dangerous situation. We had one therapist who kept saying to me, well, maybe if you did this or you did that, or you wore this or you lost weight. Or so I said, okay, I tried losing weight. A week into trying to lose weight, he comes home with boxes and containers of Haagen-Dazs ice cream. So I'm doing what the therapist is telling me. I mean, if you look at it, I shouldn't have to lose weight for him to be nice to me, but I was willing to try anything. But that was a bad therapist giving bad advice on a bad situation. And then when I said to the therapist, well, he brought home ice cream, like that's a lot harder. She goes, well, he's testing you and you have to overcome that. No, why don't you tell my husband to be nice and support me that I'm trying to do something?
Ultimately, who was the person you turned to dissolve the marriage? Like, was there a specific person in your life, a therapist, a family member, just you? How did you summon up the confidence after being chipped away at your, abusive relationship, chip away at your decision-making and your power to do that? How did you come to that choice?
I turned to my parents. My parents apparently had gone to Shalom Task Force and they had reached out on how to help me and how to guide me and what was the right thing for them to do as parents to support me, even before I knew I was getting divorced, because they realized that things were not good and things were not healthy and they didn't know what to do. So they were told not to interfere, but to leave their door open. That way, if I needed them, they were there for me.
Do you think that was the right advice?
Yes. First of all, if they would have told me to get divorced, getting divorced is one of the hardest things I've done in my life. Getting divorced from an abuser, even more so. There were days where I would have panic attacks or stress or anxiety, crying. I couldn't get out of bed, things like I physically felt the world on me. And if my parents would have told me to do that to myself, I would have been mad at my parents. By me making my own decision, they and like their therapists and people guiding us at the time were allowing me to own it. So I am so proud of what I went through in those hard times to get to where I am now. So my parents never told me what to do. As soon as I called them and I said, I want to get divorced, they supported me. They listened to me. They helped me find a lawyer. They helped me take care of that. I was lucky my parents were able to financially help me. Not everybody's in that situation, but even to just get me on the right path with the right people. I also found a phenomenal therapist, Michael Solomon. I think he was like God's gift to me. He really just helped me to find me and to become me. Like I had been so broken down over the course of my marriage that I was not me anymore and I didn't know who I was.
It's an incredibly moving story. I'm curious, was there anything, again, aside from the actual marriage, which is a tough question and not the question I'm posing to you, is there anything that you would have done differently in getting out of the marriage? Any advice you would give to yourself or others who are in a relationship that is unhealthy and are trying to figure out how to deal and how to cope out? Were the mistakes you made that you've learned something that you would impart almost to that younger self or to others?
I really don't think I made any mistakes. I really have to say that I had a phenomenal attorney, and I actually had a lot of really great friends who were attorneys or worked for attorneys or had gave me good advice, things that other people had never heard of. So I think that really helped me a lot. I think you're in a very hard emotional state and it's very hard to focus on the end goal and it's very hard to realize. And I think one of the things that my therapist made me realize as we were going through the divorce, things I was fighting for that I wanted that were important to me. My therapist goes, even if you win them, are you going to actually get them? Will he actually give them to you? And I'm like, probably not. He goes, then why are you even fighting? He goes, what do you want? Let's get you what you want and what you need. So I have a very rare situation where I do have sole legal and physical custody of my children, which was the most important thing to me in the world. In exchange for that, I gave up all financial help. So I only get the minimum for my children. I only get the minimum child support required by law.
Wow.
I don't get medical. I don't get yeshiva, nothing.
And that was a choice that you made for yourself.
Right. Because to me, my children and their lives and their mental health and their physical health was more important. And he was making good money at the time. And originally the courts had awarded me a lot of money, and it wasn't worth the life and the safety of my children. And my children and I went through a few hard years, and my kids are adults now. Like my kids are 16 and 18, and my son's in Israel now. Before he left to Israel, my kids were sitting around talking to me. They're like, do you remember when you used to make us pasta like every night for dinner? And sometimes if we were lucky, we would put ketchup on it or butter on it. And I'm like, you have no idea that it was because I couldn't afford to buy you anything else. And I didn't want to tell anybody.
Wow.
Like I didn't want people to know. I didn't even want my parents to know that I couldn't put food on the table.
Wow. It's an incredibly moving story. You mentioned advice that your lawyers gave you. Is there specific advice that stands with you today that would be helpful for others to hear who are trying to figure out their way through this?
My lawyer said to me, be very honest and accurate. A lot of people like to embellish things in court documents. He said, do not do that, because whatever you do, you might need to prove, and you don't want to have to prove something you can't prove. And my lawyer is somebody I've known my whole life. And he said to me, do not be embarrassed. I've heard worse than whatever you're going to tell me, because there were things I didn't want to tell my lawyer that I was so embarrassed about that had happened in my marriage, because there was a lot of sexual abuse in my marriage. And I didn't want to talk to him. And he goes, you have to tell me. And that was very hard to do. But I don't know. He really just was very straight.
I see a picture in the background. I don't know where you are.
That's my brother. I'm in his office. I'm hiding.
Okay. Allow me to ask, have you gotten remarried?
No, I'm not remarried. I am in a relationship with somebody. I am not remarried, but it is a wonderful, phenomenal relationship. It is a healthy relationship. My parents love him. They joke that if anything were to happen between the two of us, that they're going to go with him because they love him more than me. He's probably one of the best things that happened to my kids. Like my son called me, I'm from Israel. So before I speak ever publicly about my divorce or what went on, I always give my kids a heads up. And I tell them, and we've gone over the years, things I can or can't say or whatnot. And so I told my son that I was going to do this. And he said to me, he goes, Ma, I have to tell you that one of the best things you ever did for me is get divorced from daddy. And I started crying because as a parent, you don't know if your kids, what's going to end up being. And he said to me that, first of all, I was able to raise him in a very healthy way and really guide him. But I brought into his life individuals. I brought this guy I'm seeing, his son, into my son's life, who have been such incredible, positive role models in my son's life that my son goes, I wouldn't be where I was today if it wasn't for the fact that you got divorced.
It is incredibly powerful and moving to hear these stories.
One advice that somebody gave me years ago when I was getting divorced is if your ex-spouse is really crazy, you will not need to tell anybody that. People will figure it out, including your kids. And so from a young age, I never told my kids anything about the reason why their dad and I got divorced. As they got older, slowly started realizing things, figuring things out, asking me questions. And I would kind of say, I don't know, or they would ask me questions about their dad's second marriage. And I would say, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't live in that house. It's not my, whatever. And then my ex would start telling them stuff. And my ex told them a lot of stuff that he should have never have told them, stuff that legally he was not supposed to even tell them. But it's stuff that's bad about him, which is what makes it funnier. In my mind, like he was trying to justify. I had a criminal case against him, which we were never supposed to talk about. And he's the one who kept bringing it up constantly. So once he brings it up now, I'm allowed to talk about it. But why would you even bring it up?
Wow.
I was never going to tell the kids that. Like, why do they need to know that?
Wow.
So my kids on their own figured out who their dad is, and they're building a relationship with him on their terms.
I always ask my interviewees about books, literature, material that help them along the way. Is there a specific book that gave you strength either to get out of this relationship or the strength to find a new one, which I think requires a great deal of resilience to allow yourself to go into a new relationship given your own experiences. Are there any books, articles that stand out for you in this area?
There were no books. I think at that time when I was getting divorced, I didn't even have like the mindset. I couldn't even focus on reading like a stupid book or a magazine.
Yeah.
Even like any junky, trashy novels I couldn't even read. So there was nothing really. I think honestly, it was my therapist who really said to me, you need to be on your own. You need to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. You need to learn what and who you want to be as a mother and what you want to find in a partner. And then you can start dating. Like I waited a while between the time I separated and started dating. And I dated a bunch of people before I met the person I'm with now. I was in another serious relationship beforehand, which also really taught me a lot. And I think that you have to pay attention to who you are and what you want and what you need. And I think when you're dating a second time around, for me, it was all about my kids. And that was really a big priority.
I cannot thank you enough really sharing something so deeply personal and powerful. Breezy Schwartz, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It is heart-wrenching to hear from somebody who has actually suffered within an abusive relationship, but I did not want to end the episode on that note, really for 2 reasons. Number one, I think Shalom Task Force does so much more simply than helping people within abusive relationships. I also wanted to highlight, and I wanted to make sure that this episode did not color the experience of abuse too dramatically, so people who are really in that gray area have that ambiguity. Is this a red flag? Is this okay? I want to make sure that they are able to seek help and really have the language to understand the dynamics of their own relationship, really are able to see it clearly. And sometimes when you go to the most extreme or the most difficult cases, people are like, well, it's not that bad. Like, thank God. Like, we hate each other and we don't get along and it's absolutely awful, but it's not that bad. And sometimes when you highlight the most extreme examples, it can give people almost a cover, or it can be a distraction from the very real issues that many of our listeners, I'm sure, are grappling with. Which is why I really wanted to end our conversation with somebody who, it was almost in the process of the interview that my esteem for her and her work just was totally reimagined, and that is the executive director of Shalom Task Force. Her name is Shana. I think she published under the name Shoshannah Frydman. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. I think we covered that in the interview. She has a fascinating background. She actually did her PhD exploring some of these issues. She published an absolutely fascinating paper that I hope we can link to called The Quick Shift: Orthodox Jewish Women's Early Marital Sexual Experience, which is really about a related issue, but it was the subject of her PhD, and that PhD was titled Tradition and Transition: American Orthodox Jewish Women Preparing and Becoming Sexually Active Within Marriage, which is one of the great pressure points in marital life, of course, and a subject that I hope that we're able to explore on its own. But it was through her scholarly work on this topic that she eventually began working and is now the executive director of Shalom Task Force. And I had a conversation with her, not focused exclusively, really only came up at the very end, her doctoral work, her PhD. But what I wanted to talk about was getting the basic language for how to understand the health of a relationship, of a marriage, and what is the work that she is in fact doing inside of schools to help young people really assess and build the language and education to ensure that they're able to form healthy relationships. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our conversation with Shana Frydman. I am so excited to introduce my next guest as part of this conversation about really understanding the red flags that come up in relationships with commitment. Because I think so many people are worried, and part of the fear of commitment, so to speak, in my mind is the fact that you don't really know what you're committing to because it doesn't exist until the commitment's there. The relationship does not exist until there's a commitment, until you're kind of in this new entity together called a committed relationship. It's different than knowing the person or having a conversation with them. And there is this like concern of like, how do I know that this is going to work out well? Like somebody who I know, when they were thinking about getting married, their mother, who had been through quite a bit, said, oh, I heard stories that in the yichud room already, the spouse turns around and, smacks them or whatever it is. These kind of stories live in people's minds like, I just want to know that I'm going to be safe in this relationship. And that's why this conversation with Shana Frydman, whose last name so many have abused. We're not allowed to make abuse puns. That's on me right off the gate. I am so excited to speak with you because of your incredible work, again, with Shalom Task Force. But really what I want to talk about is not the organization. I really want to talk about this notion of red flags, preventative. And I want to begin with my healthy skepticism that we can prevent this. How do we train somebody who is on track to either be a victim or a survivor, or on the other side, an abuser in a relationship? What can you tell them before a relationship that is going to serve as a preventative measure? And when do you tell them this?
Let's just jump right in there.
Yeah, I think we should absolutely jump right in there.
I want to cling and, first of all, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure and privilege to be here. And this healthy skepticism, I live every day with that. I really do. I think I can only do the work that I've done and continue to do because I have hope that we can change things and we can prevent it. So I'm with you that we have to find ways and continue to find ways.
But let's talk
about what that means. Yeah, what does that mean? So with your permission, I want to dial back for a second to make sure that we all have a working definition of what we're trying to prevent, because the concept of domestic violence, intimate partner abuse, whatever we're talking about, isn't always understood. And if we want to prevent it, we have to understand what it is. So let's just move back there for a second and then we'll move forward. So when we're talking about domestic violence, which, in the literature is intimate partner violence, we're talking about a pattern of behaviors between one party and the other party, who's the person's trying to obtain and maintain power and control over the other person. And there's a sense of fear. So we're looking at patterns, power and control, and fear. And those are really three important components. And they take all different forms. And whenever I speak with community members or do prevention work or any of that, I think it's really important to make sure that we have this definition that's much larger than just physical violence, because physical violence is often a later tool of the person that hurts, and we could call them the assailant, the abuser, the perpetrator.
It never starts there.
It doesn't start. I've
Rarely.
counseled easily 1,000 people who are survivor victims in my life. I've never seen it start with physical violence, because then, right, if you're on a first date and someone hits you, you're not staying on a second date.
You're not
that
staying
doesn't
for
mean,
the committed relationship.
Right, there's not a commitment there, right? That's not what we're seeing. And the Yichud room story you just said, so we have heard those stories, and we could try to unpack that. But,
no, I don't want to focus on
that's
that.
not our focus. So, but we do need to understand that we're not looking only at physical violence, because physical violence is a later stage, right? We're looking at other forms of violence.
So let's take a step back and talk about those words that you use.
Yeah.
Power, control, and
fear.
And fear
patterns. Yeah.
So it's so interesting that you mentioned that. I want to understand what that means. Like, I'm thinking about my own relationship. And that's the really hard work about this, because if you're not thinking about your own relationship, if you rest on the laurels that, like, I obviously am not capable of this, I think you've already lost. I think that both from a Torah perspective and from a life perspective is that you need to treat yourself as if you are capable of doing wrong and setting up the boundaries. This is why all this work is necessary, because you can't rest on your laurels that I am never going to grapple with these issues. But tell me what that means.
Okay.
Power, control, fear.
And I think if you're real, and what's really hard about this work is that anybody who has had the privilege and joy and sometimes pain of being in a committed relationship know there's hard times, right? There are times where things are murky and can be painful, and that still is different than domestic violence, right?
In our home, we prefer to call this Shana. Shana for us.
We're not getting personal here, but I could agree with you.
A lot of people in our community, I think, does a disservice that we pretend Shana Rishona
is a honeymoon.
Is this extended honeymoon perfect relationship. And to me, Shana Rishona is like the minor leagues. It is like you've been drafted, but you're not yet getting any playing time. Right. You're not fully worked out as a team yet.
Right. And I think if we're honest, like, I don't know if you're ever fully worked out with a team, but you get better at it. You do better as a team. And then there might be other things that happen in life that make it hard again, and then you work on it again. But
let's come back to that.
Let's come back to that.
Power
control. So when we look at the idea of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, you're looking at this pattern of power and control, and then you fill in all these different ways that could happen. And that's important so we can understand how to prevent it. So we're looking at verbal and emotional abuse, financial abuse.
I need you to get really
way
more specific.
Okay. Use of demeaning language, right? Isolation as a tool of keeping that person controlled.
I don't even know what that means.
Telling that person that their friends aren't good enough for them, or their family is, we shouldn't spend time with your family. It's very innocuous in the beginning. I love you so much. I just want to spend time with you. And then the person's life becomes smaller and smaller, and they don't have relationships outside of that relationship. So, right. So they're under the control of, and they're under
their life is mediated through this relationship.
Yeah. And their life is much smaller. So they have less resources. They have less of an independent life, right? We're looking at like extreme jealousy. In our field, we look at things like stalking.
What is extreme jealousy? I feel like I have extreme jealousy, not for my wife, but for other people's success. I'm like, oh man.
I wish I was like, I know.
Extreme jealousy. What does extreme jealousy mean in a relationship?
The prototypical type is you're out and your partner looks at someone of the opposite gender in no particular way, right? No, but absolutely assuming that person is doing something wrong and then punishing that person for it. Like, how dare you? How dare you talk to that person? How dare you say good job to that person? Really being controlling of who they can interact with.
It's so interesting. There's a very graphic documentary that I can't recommend people to watch because it is so graphic, but it was extraordinarily educational, called The Vow on HBO, about the NXIVM cult, which was founded by Keith Rainier, who ended up really turning a business that was executive coaching and executive consulting, and it turned into quite literally a sex cult. And it's a documentary about how this happened and all of the things in the documentary that led ultimately to criminal sexual abuse. He's serving 120 years in prison right now, were exactly what you are describing. Cutting people off from their families, this manipulative control. I saw you looking at somebody else. You've hurt me in this way, playing the victim in order to abuse, so to speak.
Right, in order to obtain and maintain power and control. That's how we want to define it, right? So it doesn't have to look like physical violence. So it could look like, financial abuse, having all the control. And that's very different than having a joint budget, right? Most of us should have budgets and have a conversation about that with our significant other, but this is one person having complete control over with no space for a conversation. And that's where we're looking at. Like,
meaning in my home, I've mentioned this before, like we have for multiple reasons, we have a joint account and a lot of the checks come out of an account that's just my name, but my wife can always use it. She knows it. It's not like secretive.
It's not secretive. And she would say, and I don't want to she'd say, I'm no longer comfortable with that. Can we think about another way of arranging this? I'd be more comfortable if it was all joint and there can be a conversation, and she's not afraid to say that. Right. And that's where the key is. If you're afraid to say it, like, I think most relationships, people take different roles, right? Like,
I would be thrilled if my wife took over the finances in our family. It is one of the big stressors. I'm curious, you started with this language, power, control, fear, which I think is so helpful. I'm curious, and what I want to really spend a moment thinking about, are there patterns of abuse that are uniquely susceptible in the frum community? And I just want to unpack this. Meaning, is Shalom Task Force the same as any relationship organization that helps, prevent abusive domestic violence, helps people build healthy, emotionally healthy, physically healthy relationships? And if there was an organization like this in the Christian community, in the Muslim community, in the atheist community, in the, in a different country, it would more or less look the same. Or are there unique struggles within the Jewish community we are susceptible to compromise? Because in our community, we have, a lot of power and control that are kind of in some ways built into the system. We did an entire episode on Aguna issues, and I don't want to really unpack all of that right now, but I'm curious, in the patterns leading up to that, the way that spouses exert control over one another, are there unique triggers that our community is more susceptible to?
And so I think we could look at, let's say, in the dating, right? So we're one community, but we're many communities, and people date in very different ways. So sometimes our dating in some of our communities is much shorter. And I'm not saying that there's a higher prevalence. We don't have data around that, but like we have less opportunity. We might have less opportunity to actually see what's going on. So if you're looking for, patterns of possessiveness and isolation and the control and demeaning behaviors, it might not actually show if you're only meeting 5 or 6 times in some communities before you get engaged, right? And then if your engagement is fairly scripted and there isn't a lot of opportunity for a lot of time together, when would that actually unfold? When would you actually see it?
But short of changing the dating system, which I'm sure you're not advocating for, so
and then we can look at other parts, but I'm not saying that.
What are the stressors? I'm not even talking about like the systems. What are the stressors that aggravate these issues of power and control? Are they, maybe they're not unique to the Jewish community?
I think that there are some unique aspects. We often talk about the level of shame that exists in our community that might be a bit different than other communities about getting help. There's a tremendous amount of pressure still in our community to remain married. We've gotten better. But
consideration of divorce is a
much larger consideration for people in our community. They can't even envision life not being being in a marriage, and how do you raise children, and what would that look like? And we've certainly made strides, but how do we as a community, right? How do we community support families that look different, right? And there's some small things like the fathers. We always talk about the father-son learning at Shoals. Calling a father-son
can be hard for somebody
for a single
who
mom,
does not
right?
yet correct.
For whatever reason, and
or somebody whose
right?
father's not alive,
right?
Or whatever.
Right.
It is, yeah.
So how do we think through things? And those are words matter, right? We know that, and how we talk about what our community looks like and what a family should look like. And there, we do think about things like the pressure to remain married, what divorce not really being consideration, which there's a value in that, right? That people are very committed to marriage, and we want
beautiful value.
Yeah, we want people to be committed to marriage because we should work things out.
But it makes
when
it
it's
harder
possible,
to
but
confront.
It makes it harder to confront when there's real safety issues, and then not to make it feel like you can't remain in the community because you're leaving a relationship. We don't want those issues to be conflated because we want the community to embrace and remain. The survivor victim wants to remain in the community often, and they just need to find their new place in it.
I want to move back. I don't want to talk about the point
dating.
of survivors or victims. I want to start much before that. The average person, when you are sorting through, you're walking into high schools and you're doing education, you see kids who are, a few years off from marriage. Yep. Sometimes it could be a decade off from marriage. And you get them in a room and you have this opportunity to talk to them about what it looks like to foster a healthy relationship. And my question is, what do you tell them? Right. What do we get? Like, you could scare them.
No, we don't.
So what are the red flags that people should be looking out for? These words are definitely helpful: power, control, fear. But what are the red flags, the tools that you can give somebody to ensure that they avoid becoming an abuser or, God forbid, becoming a victim?
So we try to start with what is a healthy relationship. Let's plant those seeds. Healthy relationships have, open communication. You feel safe in a healthy relationship. You feel respect in a healthy relationship. And let's say those are the pillars that we think about, right? Safety, respect, communication. And then, you move into this idea of unhealthy. Like, when is it a struggle? There's some high conflict, and relationships can go back and forth, right? And then we do describe in great detail, and we plant the seeds to give language, right? It's really important that people have language for what's going on.
Like
so
what?
We teach our teens that domestic violence, intimate partner violence is about power and control. And these are the 6 or 8 forms of it. And these are things we need to look out for. We want to look out for jealousy. We want to look out for isolation. We go through a list. For dishonesty, we want to look out for people who are demeaning to you. We want you to learn to and trust your gut. And if you have this feeling, if something feels off, to think about what to do next and to not ignore that feeling, because we find that people later will say, something didn't feel right, but I didn't know what to do with it. And then we very clearly share and reiterate over and over that there are resources out there for them. Because if you do have this feeling, we're not telling people to break up with whoever they're dating. We're not telling people to break their engagement. We're not telling people to get divorced. We would never tell people what to do for a number of reasons, but to know that they need to find a space to explore it. Like, they deserve to find a space to explore
What are those spaces? I'm fascinated. I think the community is fascinated by broken engagements. I do have the impression, and I don't know, there's probably no data on this, that the notion of breaking off an engagement is happening more frequently in our community. That's what it feels like to me. It happens to be a very high stress period in a lot of people's life. I happen to have not been all that. So I found Shana more challenging to navigate. I the engagement period, I wasn't like checked out from the relationship. I was checked out from the planning. Like, I was so not involved. It didn't feel stressful for me. It was just like, oh, like, there's a party at the end of this. Okay, that sounds great. But I'm curious, what are those resources? What do you offer people? Like, somebody who's in a high stress relationship, do they need a curriculum? Like, do they need like a checklist? Like, what are the main offerings? Take me through somebody who reaches out to Shalom Task Force, maybe reaches out to the hotline, and they're concerned. They don't know. They've never been, God forbid, hit. There's no physical abuse. But I'll
tell you that we get calls, and like, for us, this is a success story. We'll have a call from someone saying, like, 5 years ago, this woman came to my school and she talked about this feeling, and I'm feeling that right now. And I'm dating someone right now.
They remember this.
They remember it. People remember, it's amazing to me. They remember all the stories that are shared. It makes it quite an impression, because I think that our teens are ready to talk about relationships, and we're the ones telling them. They don't have a lot of relationship education in our schools, right? So here, if people treat them like adults, we treat them, you're going to be adults. We want to talk to you. We're going to be real about this. And so they do remember it. And we actually have, we hear from adults who are in their 30s now saying, I remember, 20 years ago.
And when they call, what are the questions that you're trying to ask them to figure out what the next step should be?
Right. I said before that we never tell people what to do. And that has a lot to do with the fact that domestic violence is about power and control, and we don't want to assert our power and control over people. We want them to be empowered in whatever decision they go forward. So all the work you do with survivors is really client-centered and wherever they want to go. And it's an important point for anyone who's hearing this, because anyone who calls our hotline will never be told what to do. But they'll have a real, honest, anonymous, confidential conversation with someone who's trained to really walk them through. Like,
do you know the number to your hotline by heart?
I'm so bad at that. It's like the joke in the office. But it'll come to me. 1-888-883-2323.
I don't know if that's right. I don't have it in front of me. But I asked Esther.
I usually write it down before I sit with people, but I'm pretty sure that's it. But they'll be trained to kind of think it through with them and just validate what they're experiencing. Really and that's what a lot of times we need, right? We just need someone to mirror back what we're saying and give them like, wow, what you're saying is, it sounds like there's a lot you're balancing right now. And what you're saying is, and repeating it back so they can actually hear it. And we find that gets through like, oh, okay, so what I'm saying is not crazy. And then, ultimately what we usually recommend is, let's help you find someone local that you can meet with, right? Like a mental health practitioner, to think this through. Because even if it means that you're going to go forward, right? But go forward with a little bit more peace then.
How do you tell the difference between a relationship that can be salvaged and a relationship that needs to be unwound?
So I don't make that decision for anyone. I can't, right? But
is there a line?
Is there a line? So to me, it comes down to that fear factor. Are you afraid? And I've in my therapist role, I've sat with many, many survivor victims who are still in the relationship, and I would never tell them to do, but I can remember cases where I sat there going, I would tell you that I'm afraid for you right now. And how can I help you? Because I just don't think you're safe anymore. And then trying to figure out, what does that mean? What does that mean emotionally? What does that mean very logistically? There's a lot of practical ways that, when there's a decision to dissolve a relationship, it's not simple. It's more simple if you're not yet married, or more simple when you don't have a family, but it's a very big decision.
And take me through the other way. What does it look like to heal an unhealthy relationship? What is that process? What is the turning point of that? Like, there was something unhealthy. Let's say there was never any physical abuse, but there was fear and there was power, there was control, and they want to put this back together. What does that look like? People say, marriage therapy, but this is my issue with this entire topic, is that I feel like married life, our intimate lives, rightfully so, are more secretive. We know less about them. Every couple only knows themselves, so everyone's thinking like, is this normal? Like, is this the right amount? Like, I've gotten into a fight with my spouse. And like, nobody knows the thresholds of normalcy versus not normalcy. Nobody really understands what's salvageable and what's not salvageable, because it's rightfully so.
I don't know that there's any sort of like measure of that, right? Like, it's not my decision, but I would say that in our field, we do not recommend couples that have any kind of active domestic violence, including emotional, verbal, not coercive control, the non-physical ones, to be in couples counseling together. We know that to not be safe, right? Because couples counseling comes down to both people taking responsibility and accountability for their behaviors, right? And someone who is causing harm, who's abusive, is not taking responsibility for their behavior. And the other person should not take responsibility for that person's abuse, right?
They should be separate.
They need to be separate. That is a separate process. If they choose to at some point get back together, it has to be done with a lot of thought and strategy, with a lot of accountability. If you want to talk about empirical evidence around it, and what we do know is the few programs that have done that well, and there are very, very few programs that have done that well, are often insular communities, Native American, like we're really talking about, that's what the research is. They have like community members holding the person who has caused harm accountable for their behavior. And there's like this radical honesty and like accountability around it, because what happens behind closed doors happens behind closed doors. And we don't know. And if someone's afraid of the other person, they're not going to report it to the counselor, because it will only get worse, right? You're not going to go into your marriage therapist saying, oh, this week he actually demeaned me in front of the children, didn't let me buy anything, and hit me. You're going to go home and it's going to be worse, right? So that's why if it's a domestic violence, if it really, it's evaluated and there's this level of power control and fear, we do not recommend that they go into counseling. We see it as a risk. If it's a family, a couple that's going through some high conflict situations, and they're both like just
high conflict. I like that term.
Yeah, high conflict.
What does that mean?
There's incompatibility. They might be not having empathy for each other. They just can't hear each other anymore, but nobody's afraid of each other, right? There isn't one person that has like this extreme power and control. And it doesn't mean that we don't have different roles in our relationship. You talked about being more involved in the finances. That's fine. Like, it happens to be my family. I'm less involved in that. I'm basically solely responsible for the educational decisions for my children. It's kind of like I'm better at it. I have more opinions. But if my husband said to me, I don't like the school we're sending to, we would have a conversation. Nobody's afraid of that conversation, right?
There's a great bit by Nate Bargatze. Nate Bargatze is talking about the school calls him up and asks him to pick up their children children, they're sick or something, and Nate, who's this great comedian, he's like,
Doesn't know where the school is.
He's like, did you mean to call me? Like, what school
My husband
is calling up the dad? Like, the bus? I don't know what school
there a
he's
bus?
in. I have very little information in this area, but obviously that's not power and
But
control.
that's not power and control because if I want, like I said before, if your wife said to you, like, I would like to know more about our finances, or like, where are the passwords? I just want to be able to check in on things. You wouldn't be like, no, absolutely not. It's mine. That's a very different situation than someone saying, your paycheck's going in here. You have no access to it. You're going to be on an allowance. It's a very different dynamic, and it feels very different. So high conflict relations, incompatibility, high stress times, maybe lack of empathy at the time, not being able to connect in positive ways, but both parties saying, okay, we're going to figure this out. Like, we're committed to figuring this out. And it may not. At the end, they don't figure it out. Maybe it isn't the right relationship for them, but there isn't the sense of danger or being unsafe. It's different. It really is.
When you go into a high school and you are doing education.
Can I tell you something? You could cut this, but it's just funny. I lecture in front of like 500 NYPD without sweating. High school students, man.
It's a nightmare.
I find teenagers, they are so smart. They ask amazing questions, and I don't sleep the night before I go to high school. So
I'm totally with you on this.
But NYPD, yeah, no problem. I could have 800 out there, full uniform. I could talk for 3 hours.
Nothing makes me more nervous, and I am
That's your
educated.
field, yeah.
Nothing makes me more nervous than talking to high school kids.
I think it brings back all my adolescent angst.
All of it.
Like,
I feel
I'm
the
as awkward as
judgment.
possible.
I feel the judgment. I feel the cynicism.
Yeah.
I feel deeply.
I relate to it. I'm like,
I feel deeply inadequate whenever I'm
Yeah.
in front of teenagers.
okay, it's not just me.
No.
It's like the joke in The Office. Like, yeah, Shana, go to NYPD. Talk to the.
I'm making fun of myself.
Yeah.
Like I'm like I have a voice in my head like this guy. Like this guy think like who's this guy?
Yeah.
Like just like what every high
I'm
school
in good
kid
company,
says.
yeah.
But
Okay.
I'm curious when you
Yeah.
go into a high school, just take me through what that presentation is.
Yeah, sure.
How long is it? Where does it begin? And give me the basic
You
structure
got
of what it is.
Okay. Most schools have us in for around 75 to 90 minutes. We have 2 programs, but let's focus on the fundamental workshop. which
Are
we
you
call it.
Are you just in the Mount Orthodox
No,
community?
No,
You're
we're in the Beis Yaakov. We have different curriculum for different communities.
Okay.
We have one that's the Beis Yaakov. We have one for the Beis Medrash.
And what are those differences mostly?
Mostly the media clips, not the clinical information, but like a modern Orthodox school is comfortable with, TV as.
Where you draw your clips from. We'll get that
all
in a
over.
second. No, I want to know.
Yeah.
Because I fancy myself. I do appreciate pop culture. And a lot of movies, I think, have done a tremendous service in depicting that inner life of what a failed relationship looks like, an unhealthy relationship looks like. There's some sensitivity issues because of obviously modesty,
So we have to,
etc.
so even, in all schools, we try to keep it very modest, and we make sure the language is appropriate, and we show it to all the principals and administration if they choose to beforehand.
But take me in. So you get around.
And then the Beis Yaakovs, we have self-produced clips, basically.
Oh,
that
cool.
We produce.
So you get between
75 minutes to 90 minutes.
Okay.
And we're real about what that is, the expectations around that. We're planting seeds. We're giving people language, and we hope that.
No. You're not being specific enough for me.
Okay, let's.
I like to understand real processes.
Got
When
it.
we did our issue on Agunot, I asked Rabbi Shlomo Weissman, take me through the get process. Not like we go in, we write the get, and then we're finished.
Okay,
Like,
so we show up.
where do you
and we
start?
We
Where do
start
you
with,
start?
hi, we're from Shalom Task Force. We're here to talk to you about relationships today. And most of them are like, oh yeah, we've heard about this before. It's the cool 12th grade workshop. We're really excited, right? We start with this idea of what do you think a healthy relationship is? And we have different exercises for some of the schools. Is like, what kind of person do you want people to set you up with, or what do you think is a good aspect? And we do we have an interactive, what is a healthy relationship?
and people are raising their hands. Everybody's okay.
there. We have between 20 and 25 kids. We split them up so it's small.
Great.
And then we move into what do you think an unhealthy relationship is?
Do you ever get common wrong answers? Obviously, every day there's no wrong answers. But do you get any?
I don't know. I don't think we get common wrong
Okay.
answers. But we just we use them, right? you use them in the presentation.
Okay, so you start off. What is a healthy relationship?
What is an unhealthy?
Unhealthy.
And then we
What's
talk
next?
about this idea. Let's take a step back about trusting your gut. What would it mean to look at a relationship and look at things and say what feels wrong, what feels what would you do with that? So we just kind of put that as a framework, and then we introduce what domestic violence is, and we do that through clips. We do it through scenarios. We read scenarios to them.
What is your favorite clip?
There's one in This Is Us that we got really into this year.
Oh, sure,
Yeah.
on NBC, the
Yeah,
TV
and
show.
yeah, so
I tapped out in the middle of it, of the episodes.
It's one of the earlier. It's one of the.
But I
earlier
heard the
seasons.
end. The ender seasons are also fantastic.
Yeah, so it's one of the early.
It's a
seasons.
fairly clean show.
It's a fairly clean show, and we were able to use it in a way that felt comfortable for schools.
Because what does that scene show?
It shows a scene where the teen daughter is kind of hiding a conversation and being really, her abusive boyfriend keeps on calling and then the mother not sure what to do with it, and then we were able to use it later about how the mother approaches the daughter. So we introduced that,
It highlights something about kind of modern relationships. I'm curious, how have you seen social media, phones, texting, WhatsApp have borne upon, have reshaped the contours of healthy and unhealthy relationships?
And we do a whole workshop, a 9th grade workshop about how to stay safe online and technology and relationships, because it has totally changed how we all interact.
This is an
with each
issue
other.
that
it's
I know a
huge.
lot of people are grappling with.
Yeah, I mean, it's really significant.
Because what is the fear that you are really worried about?
I mean, there's the whole range of fears. The fear of you're meeting people who are unsafe online. So that's on the
Okay,
side,
that's
right?
like
Let's
old-
put that to the side, right? Like, I mean, it's huge, but
yeah, but it
there's
feels
the
a little
whole
like almost
grooming.
like old school to me. Yeah.
It's old school, but we see it happening.
Okay,
so,
sure.
you know, also the piece
I think
that
there are things happening
teens-
with people that they know.
No, right? So then the teens not understanding boundaries and sending pictures that are
That's a
explicit
big issue,
pictures.
yes.
And there's no school that we've gone into. I was just like, no school that we've gone to that teens don't say, yeah, of course we do it. Of course we do it.
It's a huge issue.
It's absolutely what we do.
I want to come back
Yes,
to the
sure.
marriage workshop.
Yeah.
So then you show them this clip. You did a clip from This Is Us.
Yeah.
And now you're introducing the language of domestic violence. What is that language that's coming back to power,
Yep.
control, fear, high conflict relationships versus abusive relationships?
So we start with the spectrum. Like we start with the continuum. We do the healthy, unhealthy. We walk into domestic violence. We do a real deep dive into what domestic violence, going through all the
What is
forms.
that spectrum?
Healthy, unhealthy. So we talk about what are the
Okay.
components of a healthy, what are the components of an unhealthy, what that looks like. Then we walk into domestic violence. We focus most on domestic violence so that they have the language, all the different forms. We give examples. They share examples. We go through some scenarios of like, what does this sound like to you? You know, these two kids are having this, you know, they're on a date.
Can you give me an example of a scenario?
So one example we often will share is something to the effect of that the person you're dating insists on seeing your phone and going through all your phone and having all your passwords and reading all your texts. And what is that like? And the person's justifying like, well, if you have nothing to hide, then should I have that?
And what do you think about that? That's so interesting.
Isn't that interesting? So
Because my wife does have the password to my phone. She's never asked me to go through it. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that.
Yeah.
I don't know that I want somebody going through all
Right.
of my phone.
And
I
you're
don't
allowed to have,
any-
and so part of that is how do you have that conversation with the person? Can you say to someone, I really have my personal boundaries. Like I'm allowed to have relationships.
That is okay, you're
right?
saying.
Like, yeah. Or, you know, if I'm forcing you to do that, what does that feel like? And so really having a conversation about what does that feel like and how can you have those conversations and how does that fit into this? And we're not naming it either way yet, right?
And
We're
that
just
this
saying-
is the...
But you are, and even in your most important relationship in your marriage, you are allowed to have personal boundaries. You're allowed to have your own space. You're allowed to have your own interests, right?
Give me another scenario that you do. I like that scenario a lot.
We show this self-produced little clip where it's clear that the girl is davening mincha. It goes right through like she's davening on her phone. And
Okay.
every second there's a text from the person she's dating. Where are you? I'm talking to you. Da, 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 da. I'm going to come over. The intensity is
Feeling that nervousness.
And she finally Shimon Esrei writes back, I'm davening. And he's like, well, you could just answer me. And like, you know, keeps on going. And it's again, a discussion around what is that? Is there no personal space? Can you say, give me a second?
Do you do the same scenarios for men and women?
For the most part, yes, we do.
So now you do the scenarios. Take me through to the end of the training. I'm curious.
Right. So
what
we go
else.
through that and then we talk about why is it so hard for people? If this is what they're experiencing, what are the pressures in the community? And we talk about like the practical reasons people may remain in these relationships. What are the cultural reasons? You know, we talk
Like what are you seeking to elicit? What is the reflection that you are looking?
So we're seeking to elicit the fact that first of all, we have to have empathy for people. Like this is not a simple thing. But also that as community members and as future adult community members, we as the community have to help mitigate those issues, right? So if we know that someone's going through this, how do we as the other community member, because it's not only about us.
That was
being-
legitimately my next question.
Yeah.
What do you do if you see a friend, a family member who is in an unhealthy relationship?
Right, so that's actually our next slides. Those are actually what we do next. Is we talk about like how to be a supportive friend, like how to use language of like saying I'm concerned about you, not being judgmental. If someone does approach you and share something, to believe them. Like, don't ask, well, what did you do? Or tell me more about that. Or, no, there's no way he could. Like, our natural reaction might be, oh, that's no way that could have happened. But it did happen if someone's telling that to you. And then to take a step back, that you can't rescue that person. And we do a whole piece about being a rescuer versus being a helper. That we can't rescue the person, but we could certainly be an anchor to them. And we have to really follow their lead around that. And to expect it to not be so linear and simple, but to be that person. And so that is actually the next part we do is we transition from what does this look like, how hard this is for someone, and then what can we do as a community member, as a person. And what's really neat is we have this other program that we do like leadership training with teens, and we get calls and chats to our hotline from other teens saying, you know I went to my friend who's one of your fellows because I was having a hard time in a relationship, and you know she was great and she told me I should be in touch with the hotline. So that's exactly what we want to see, right? We want people being comfortable talking to fellow community members, friends, other kids, and then saying, hey, there are resources for you, like you're not alone. And those kind of statements are so powerful to someone who's struggling. that they're not the only one. Even the fact that, I often think about like the signage in our community institutions. When you see something that acknowledges a problem exists, it's so gratifying and helpful to the person who's struggling, because then they know, right?
Shalom Task Force had one of the most powerful ad campaigns that I grew up with. I don't think you guys run it anymore. Maybe you do. It said, "It hurts to call a domestic violence hotline. It hurts more not to."
That resonates. People always talk to me about that.
I remember it to this day. You don't see it as much. I think there were stickers that would have the number. It hurts to call a domestic violence hotline. It hurts more not to. That was quite powerful. I'm curious, how do you conclude? What is the takeaway? Like, what is the final message that you leave the students with?
So our final message is around supporting each other. What would you do? And we really try to empower students to be active in the prevention in their own community. And then this year we actually added something about, let's say you heard this and something, and you feel like you might be the person who's hurtful and hurting someone else, right? So you talk about how do we prevent somebody from being abusive? And so we started getting questions from people I feel like I'm doing this in a relationship. So we plant the seeds there very strongly that certainly if you see yourself doing this behavior, you need to get help around that. And you shouldn't be in a relationship right now if you're being hurtful to someone else.
And when you say help, is that a euphemism for therapy?
Yeah, it's not a euphemism. You should go for therapy.
Yeah.
You should go for therapy. And listen, I'm a proponent that everybody should be in therapy. But I would say that...
Big time.
Right. I think that's something that we need to talk about. Domestic violence or not, people are entering the most important relationship of their lives, and they need to get to know themselves a bit better.
Do you have any games that you've designed for couples while they are dating to assess their relationship health, or any self-assessments for people to gauge?
It's on my wish list. I was just talking to a potential funder about doing
I think it's crazy. Yeah. People need that. NCSY design. We designed it for teens, but it's actually used much more by people dating. It's called the NCSY box. The box. I don't mean to plug this product in the middle of this interview, but here we are. The box, which kind of has these conversation cards for couples. It's for teens, actually. It was made not for couples, for teens, on buses of summer programs, whatever it is. And what I always thought of is that for a Shalom Task Force to develop a card game and a self-assessment, to both self-assess your own vibes in the relationship, not as you add up the points as you should break this off or you should get married, but just a self-assessment of a safety assessment.
So we do have, I believe it's on our website, there are some self-assessments of how am I feeling, is this happening? It's different what you're saying, and I agree. I think that's something that we really should, it is on our wish list. You do have
some self-assessments,
but there are substances out there of just asking questions. Are you afraid? Is this what's, going through those kind of questions? A lot of what happens.
I feel like so many people are in unhealthy relationships and they don't know that, because there's no baseline. This is what I'm talking about. It's so private. It's I don't know if this normal. It has to do with everything related to the normalcy of marriage. And I guess the answer is there is no normal, whatever. But there's
a standard,
there's a spectrum, and people don't know.
And things fall off of it. And to us, right, so we come down to the spectrum of when there's a sense of real, you don't have any self-determination, there's power and control, and there's fear. To us, that's where the line is. Now, what the line means is up to that person, right? They can choose to remain in a relationship like that. And I've counseled women who have stayed in decades of relationships like that. And my work with them is just to stay as safe as possible and find other meaning in their life. They have chosen to stay in that relationship. So, and I have to respect that. That's their choice, right? And that's what some people are like, this is my line, and if it goes past this line, I'm walking out the door, and they do, literally with their clothes on their back, or I'm breaking off this engagement, or, I'm going to pause things right now and think about what's going on. I don't know that we could ever tell people what to do, but to give people as much information and support around whatever decisions they're making is really important.
Somebody who either, maybe they went to your 75 to 90 minute training, maybe they didn't, but now they are dating, they're in a relationship, and they're saying, look, I just don't know. I'm looking for some guidance, for something that I could do on my own. We don't have this self-assessment. They're looking for something. Is there a starting point that you would tell people to assess the health, normalcy, concerns, to address the concerns? What is that first step that you would tell somebody? Or when they are dating, they're just in those early years, what is one step that you could take to suggest and to help people take better control of developing and assessing their own healthy relationships?
I'm not sure this is where you're going with it, but I think if you are in a relationship, to really take the time to get to know the other person and see how you can manage things together, and actually try to get through conversations and see what it really means to have different opinions and to manage any difference, because that's what we're looking for. If you're able to work through those issues. I'm not sure that's where you're going with it. I mean,
I want to follow up with this. What is the guidance that you get? there are so many differences with financial issues, with what about religious issues? What about religious difference? How do you guide couples and over the course of a relationship, people's religiosity can change, can evolve, can
Probably
de-evolve?
should, right?
What is the framework? What is the language? What are the broad concepts that you talk about? Because that is unique to the Jewish community. About couples that one member of the couple, or maybe both together, but in different directions, are changing religiously. How should they think about that?
So I don't
because
know,
there's halachic issues involved. And I get this question a lot. And I'm a cowboy, so I'm just kind of like, they're not coming to me as a therapist. They're just looking for a little bit of advice.
So I don't know that that's domestic violence per se. That's
No, this
relationships,
is
right?
not domestic
To
violence.
me, it all comes down to respect. Respect for difference, respect, how do you manage through it? And I'm not a halachic guidance. I don't do halachic guidance either, right? I'm not from that position, but can you respect each other? And is there force involved? If one person chooses to no longer keep Shabbos in a certain way or keep important, is
A woman stops covering their hair.
That's a really hard thing for a relationship. That could be really hard. That could be really hard for the husband. I can imagine.
Have
that's
you
really
ever
hard.
dealt with relationships that the trigger is religious?
Domestic violence isn't about a trigger; it's about a choice to have power and control over someone. So they might say it was religious, but it's not about religion. It's about power and control. Have I been involved in relationships where?
But the husband says, I want to push back on this. But
fine.
the husband says, it's not my power and control. It's the Abishter. It's God.
So then
it's
that's
halacha.
Right.
So what do you tell that husband who says, I'm not enforcing, I'm enforcing the rule of...
So the language of enforcement in a marriage is a concerning language, right? That in itself is a concerning language. I would validate that husband or the wife. The husband decides to do something also that is no longer...
So what's the language that you would tell that husband? Somebody who is uncomfortable, or spouse, who is uncomfortable with a religious change that the spouse is making. How could they say that in a way that is emotionally healthy? I know how they could do it in an emotionally unhealthy way. You cannot do that. That is, you're violating halacha. I will not allow that in my house. I will not allow this. This is not happening.
And what does that mean? You're not going to allow it? Does that mean we're
I'm
divorcing?
modeling
Right.
the unhealthy way.
Right. So that's, if someone would come to me saying, I can't believe my wife is no longer covering her hair. That is I would validate how painful that is. That is that could be very painful for that person.
Stick with this.
I don't know that. I would find that very painful. What does that mean for you? What is that going to mean for your family? How do you want to manage this? This might be the beginning of a journey for you, and how either you connect in a different way or you choose to no longer connect. But you can't force someone to do something. Right? You can't, enforcing a behavior is not language within a marriage.
I could not agree with you more, and I want to say, and this is so important, that this issue about managing religious differences in a relationship, this is an under-discussed issue. And this is where there's a lot of change in this. A lot of change from the dating period. You get, with the language used, you get read, you get describe somebody in one way religiously, and then there's the engagement period, showing your best behavior. Then there's I'm using air quotes here, Shana Rishona, which is usually, can be anywhere ranging from a honeymoon to an unmitigated disaster. And then you have like the rest of your lives together. And people really evolve a lot, particularly in our community.
And they should, right? We want people to
I
evolve.
love that.
We want people, but can there be respect around it? And how do we come to some sort of negotiation? There might be negotiation. It might be that she needs to cover her hair in certain situations. I don't want to use that thing because I feel like it.
No, I do want to use it.
But
that's exactly why I want to use it.
hair covering is so emotionally triggering to women. Here, I'm a
That's exactly why I want to use it.
Woman, right? So I'm like, in that space. But in the sense of it, there is, but yeah, any of those things, right? In the sense of like, you don't want to be forceful, but there are ways that you have to negotiate.
I think you should come back to hair covering.
Okay, I'll come back to hair covering.
No, because I think it is the fact that it is so emotionally triggering. The fact that it is so
it's so intimate. Hair covering
so
is
intimate.
such an intimate.
It is so,
it is, and people don't acknowledge it. It's
exactly. That's why I want to stick with that as an example, because I had a conversation last night. The person sitting in your chair, God willing, I hope by the time this episode airs, this person's going to be engaged. But this was the issue he came to talk about. He said discomfort, uncomfort, different standards, different ways of doing this, and providing the language for how to build healthy relationships, to be able to have these, to go into the space where it's most triggering, most difficult, most potential for it to crumble, and be able to build trust in that space too, and in that conversation too. That to me is the holiest work, and it's the work of Shalom Task Force.
We hope to. Yes, that's what we strive for. I mean, really, how do we show respect to each other? How do we negotiate things in relationships in a healthy way that's not forceful or taking power over someone else is really key to it.
Shana, I cannot thank you enough for spending this time and for the work, encouragement, and support that you provide to the community, that you have provided to me in a very specific way. Our families obviously are intertwined. I know my sister, Sarah, she would kill me for saying it, but she's very involved in Shalom Task Force. And I, thank God, have never in my life needed to call the Shalom Task Force hotline. But in a way, my sister Sarah is my hotline, for real. And she has provided that guidance because everybody in life, it's not embarrassing, everybody in life has contended with real issues related to relationships, related to marriage at every point in their lives, and having people who you can reach out to as sounding boards. And I probably am a beneficiary of the training that she has been through. Really is a tremendous service. I don't like talking about the community. It's a tremendous service to me, individuals, and we are so appreciative. I always conclude my interview with more rapid fire questions. Shana, what books would you recommend? Give me reading material for somebody who wants to understand the mechanics of healthy and unhealthy relationships. Where do you suggest they start? If you were to recommend a book or books, what would you tell them?
Lisa Torsky, a colleague of ours, wrote a really fabulous book about Am I Crazy? Is this relationship abusive? And really goes through the continuum. And it's for the community.
What's the title of it?
I have to look it up. It's something like
it's like Am I Crazy?
Or something to that effect. It's like a really good
look
title.
It up. Look it up. That's a great book.
It's a great book.
I love titles for these dating books. They're always like a little spunky.
I am so confused. Am I being abused?
I am so confused. Am I being abused?
And it's a great primer of just really looking at the continuum of relationships, what is healthy, what is unhealthy, and what is abusive. And then there's some other books out. Lundy Bancroft has written a bunch of books.
Speak slowly.
Lundy Bancroft.
Oh, do you know the name of that
Why
book?
is he doing that? And talks about the abuser.
Okay.
There's another book by Lisa Fontes. I believe it's called Chained, but she talks about coercive control and non-physical abuse. And if there's a fantastic book that was a New York Times bestseller called No Visible Bruises by Rachel Louise Snyder.
No Visible
Bruises.
That's a powerful title.
And it talks about how domestic violence and how dangerous it is, even though it's not always physical. So those are important.
Those are
books.
Really great recommendations. I appreciate that. My next question, I know you already have a PhD. What is your PhD in?
I have a PhD in social welfare and policy.
Wow. What was the title of your dissertation?
Tradition and Transition, Orthodox Women's Experience with Kala Classes and Early Marital Intimacy.
That is absolutely fascinating. Can you find it online?
Absolutely, yeah. Shoshannah Frydman under CUNY Works.
I would
and I have
really.
I have.
And you studied Kala classes.
I am a college teacher by training, but I studied the experience of women in their college. It was a mixed method study. Their experience of what their experience was in Kala classes, and then there was a piece about about post marriage, what their experience in early marital intimacy was like, and what they would have loved to have learned, and how do we transform that experience and support healthier relationships.
I normally ask people, I got a little stuck on this because I think it's so fascinating. I normally ask people, they give you a great deal of money to go back to school to get a second PhD. That is a triggering question. I want to ask you, can you give me, just really quickly, were there key takeaways that you found from Kala classes in early?
Sure. I mean, the people who are most successful were reported feeling most comfortable going into marriage around their intimacy and sexuality, were people who had Kala teachers that were really explicit and gave real information. So, I mean, that's like the biggest takeaway. Like, we have to be more real about our sex ed in our community. And we also have to be more out there with telling people that there's help. And that's not around domestic violence. That's just around marriage and sexuality and sex and marriage.
All of this is intertwined.
Yeah, so when I went for my PhD, I was already working. I went back, I did it. I was working full time in the field of domestic violence, and I was like, there's no way I'm studying domestic violence for 7 years. Like, I cannot do that. So I decided to kind of, this
is a cousin. It's the mirror image. It's not about when it falls apart, but about how do you foster intimacy, and we have a community that does it. And you studied that to know that there is a PhD on what works and what doesn't work in Kala classes is so crucial. Yeah. And I'm so happy to know that PhD is out there. And again, your key takeaway, it didn't take you long to figure it out, was being explicit, actual information, using probably proper biological terms and all of that, and to really explain what the world...
It all comes down to giving people language and normalizing life, right? And giving
normalizing life.
But I would not do a second PhD.
You're tapping out of the second question. My final question, I am always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning? I try to go to sleep
between 10:30 and 11. I'm up before 6.
Before 6?
I got young kids still, so...
I got young kids too, but they're on their own if they're waking up before 6.
No, I have things to do before they get up, so...
When my kids get up before 6, I say, Godspeed, Hatzlacha Rabbah. Hope it works out.
So no.
Shoshannah Frydman, an absolute privilege and pleasure to have you, and thank you for all of your work and the work of Shalom Task Force.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
The part of the conversation that I wish we had more time to unpack, because it is a question that so many people have reached out to us over, is the question of religious distinctions within a marriage. It is something that I hope that we're able to do a future podcast just dedicated to that question of how religious differences are held and negotiated within a marriage, because it's certainly something that I've heard from so many of our listeners, not just those who are dating, but even more frequently from those married who are trying to figure out the comfort or what they should be okay with within a marriage. And I think more than any red line, we obviously spoke specifically about hair covering, but is really how you communicate and negotiate with those red lines. And every person subjectively may have different lines of their own. But I think particularly within our community, when you integrate, or kind of there's this cross-pollination between the emotional health of the marriage and the religious character of the home, which I know so many people, myself included, deal with this constantly, of like how to ensure that both parties in a relationship, the spouses, or if they're dating, whoever it is, are comfortable with one another's religious expressions and have things that are out of bounds and have things that are within bounds. I am a reference, not for so many people, but for some people, on their like what we call shidduch resumes, which we'll talk a lot about on this series. And I remember I had a conversation with a mother who called me up to find out about a guy, and she was absolutely furious because she was doing research into this guy, and I'm on his shidduch resume, and she said, does he want a girl who covers her hair? And I remember I asked the guy this before. He said he really leaves that choice to her. And she said, well, that is a deal breaker. That is a red flag. My daughter does not want somebody who is giving her that choice. She wants somebody who insists on it. And I thought that was a fascinating lens to a conversation. I'm not actually criticizing each side. I'm criticizing that mother for other reasons. The questions she was asking before that were kind of bizarre, I'll be absolutely honest with you, given that neither party in this relationship were just beginning dating, and it sounded like she was asking shidduchim questions about, looking into a 21-year-old rather than somebody who was, more than a decade older than that. So I think sometimes our questions need to change, and that is definitely something we will talk about later on. But I think this very question, do you want somebody who leaves you that choice, or do you feel more comfortable with someone who insists on it? I thought that was actually a fascinating lens to understand different comfort levels in the religious character of a relationship itself. I think perhaps that has evolved over the last 100 years, particularly on that issue. I'm not giving anybody advice or talking about the halachic requirements of covering your hair. It is a hot button, emotionally laden issue, which is why I was kind of so insistent that we do talk about it. That's why it is so important to discuss, to not leave unspoken, to not leave just, let's just see how uncomfortable each of us can get, but seeing how we negotiate specifically through deeply personal decisions in our religious lives in the context of a relationship. I know the most challenging but most gratifying conversations I have had with my wife relate to issues related to that, of being able to talk about comfort levels and, things that each of us may do that may make the other party uncomfortable, and being able to have, I hate that I just used the word party to describe my wife, but here we are. I love my wife. I just want to state that for the record in case any of our listeners reach out and said, your husband just referred to you as a party in a relationship, as if it's a lawsuit, God forbid. But I think being able to talk through those most difficult issues in a healthy way for one spouse, for one person in a relationship to say, I don't know that I'm totally comfortable with this. How can we negotiate this? How can we talk about this? How can we bring this to life instead of being either authoritarian or just saying, do whatever the heck you want and not paying attention to your own discomfort, but finding that middle area to have those conversations is not a weakness in a relationship, but I think is the ultimate source of its strength. So thank you so much for listening. This episode was sponsored by our dearest friends, Jerry and Esther Williams, in honor of the incredibly important work of Shalom Task Force. And I remain so grateful, not only for their recognition of the work of 1840, but really for their friendship, their advice, their kindness over all these years. This episode was edited by our dearest friend who has gone above and beyond the last couple of weeks. So I really want to take 30 seconds, not 30, but 3 seconds to give her an extra thank you to our dearest friend, my colleague, who this would never happen without her, Dina Emerson. Thank you so much. Thank you for not actually killing me. It means so much to me because I know this has been messy, and your support really means the world for me, particularly that couple weeks. We've had to navigate a couple really tough issues. If you've enjoyed this episode or any episode, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You could also donate at 1840.org/donate. Once again, that's 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You could also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode that we are already making preparations for. That number, the voicemail, 917-720-5629. Once again, that number is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18 followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.